Thanks, Jonathan. Good morning. Just to say, I'm Taz, and I still identify with my physical self. I'm probably the least technological savvy person in this room, so let's just get that out of the way now. So why am I here? I'm here because I want to talk about the power of storytelling. Because I want to sort of take up some of Amelia's challenges, really, because I think as leaders, it's important that we don't just put stuff out there, that we make it available, we make it something that human beings can respond to. So I am passionate about the idea that storytelling and tales can help transform the way that we spread technology. Now, I'm just putting these up there, not because I'm boasting, it's just because I work with lots of different clients, lots of different sectors. I think it says in my bio, man of many lanyards. But I find the common sort of challenges across all these organizations. How do I stand out? How do I differentiate my business, my product, my service? How do I create attention? How do I communicate with my audience? And again, that's one of the areas I think that storytelling can help us with. Just to let you know, I'm going to be around later. I'm going to be signing and selling some books. I say selling because I still have 2 grown-up children living at home. Tried changing the locks. Nothing works. This is the new book, Classical Marketing. Any classicists, lapsed classicists in the room? Not surprised. Okay, maybe one. Just to let you know, I was, as I say, many years ago, a classicist, and I'm still interested. So I did spend a lot of my time with Homer, Virgil, and Nero. I don't know if anyone recognizes this. Do you recognize this? Bit of audience participation, Squid Game. Again, if anyone was watching this, there was an interesting Latin expression around the room where the contestants were held. Hodie mihi cras tibi. Today me, tomorrow you. The missing word being death. Sorry, it's a bit morbid early in the morning. But. So, anyone from North London? Anyone? Yeah. Anyone recognize this cinema? Please tell me. It's the Phoenix Cinema. It's the oldest continually running cinema in the UK. I used to be a trustee for over 20 years until the Charity Commission issued guidelines that you should only be a trustee for over 6. But I'm going to just, again, get a little bit of sort of stuff going in the room, audience participation. So there will be some film-related questions, okay? If you like anything I say, that's my Twitter or X handle, at Tasgal Hill. If you don't, at Piers Morgan. We talk an awful lot in storytelling about the magic number 3. So we see 3s everywhere. Veni, vidi, vici, liberté, égalité, fraternité, 3 wise men, 3 blind mice. The number of times you're a lady. So you're going to see lots of 3s throughout this talk. So this is roughly what I want to talk about for the next sort of 25 minutes or so. I want to be clear. I'm not saying facts and information don't matter. That would be nonsense. But my point is, if you want to get human beings emotionally involved with your product, your technology, your services, you've got to go beyond just raw facts and information. How do you do that? Well, obviously, I'm here to talk about the power of stories. Storytelling is something that human beings do naturally. So why don't we use that? Why don't we remind ourselves about the power of storytelling? I'm not going to read the last line out because there isn't time. But I'll just give you 3 tips as the session goes on. Why am I talking about facts and information? This is a quote by an economist called Herbert Simon. He said this in 1971, before the World Wide Web was even a twinkle in Tim Berners-Lee's eyes. And that hasn't changed simply because of the way that our brains are designed. We don't have enough attention because our brain hasn't got the energy. So the rest of this talk, if you like, is an answer to this question. How do you grab and retain people's attention? One way you don't do it is by using jargon. Okay? I'm just going to leave that up there. If anyone can tell me what that means, I'll be sitting at the desk at the back later. Something from the FT. Please, if you do tell me what it is, I'll be very relieved. Often people say to me, I've got it in for facts and numbers. Well, it's not just that. People often say to me, visuals. If you make things visual, it works with the brain, because our brain processes things visually, doesn't it? Well, not always. Now, I don't know how many of you came today on the tube. You may recognize that as a sort of bastardization of Harry Beck's famous sort of tube map. Now, it may be a process flow map, it may be, but there's no way that for most normal people who don't work in IT, that they can process that. It's just not working with the brain. Interestingly, if you want to have a quick look at the top, this is version 3. This is an improvement. I did have somebody from Deloitte come to my training a while ago, and I said, could you send me versions 1 and 2? Never heard back. Again, our brain cannot compute in the way that we think computers do. Now, I come from Essex originally, and I was very interested to see this. And I was really quite pleased that this woman had her driving fine ban overturned, simply because it's impossible for the brain to take in so many different and conflicting sources of information. Again, it's not working with the brain, it's working against the brain. Now again, as I say, I come from Essex, in Southend in Essex, so I can say this. This was called a blight on Chelmsford. Again, I grew up not far from there. Being a blight on Chelmsford is a really high bar to clear. AI, we've heard a lot about AI. As I say, I'm not an expert. But I did notice this with some amusement. Somebody asked AI to generate like a children's alphabet. I give it about 4 or 5 out of 10, I think. Dolphin and elephant don't quite work. There's no F, there's no L. I don't know how many of you came on the tube. Maybe some of you didn't come on the tube. You came on a Jupitane. Also, I've never seen a shakak before. And there's 2 different types of sheep. I also think if there is a letter representing sheep, it should be U. Oh, thank you. I'm glad you got that one. So again, we're not quite there, I think, with AI. So my point is, let's use storytelling, because storytelling works with the brain, not against the brain. And that's like one of my sort of key mantras. Now, I've got a book at the back, which was on that first list, called the Insight book. I'm interested in what insight is. An insight is broadly when you see something new or you see something you thought you knew in a different light. And a lot of it happens at an unconscious level in our brains. Our brain sees new patterns and connections, and suddenly it makes an aha or a eureka moment. And this happened to me, and I'm going to give you the sort of outcome of that. I was trying to write a speech for a client, and I was talking about the brain, and I wrote down, typed, attention span, the sort of thing I showed you earlier. But I don't think any of you are on your computers, which is good. But if you look at a keyboard, the letters N and M are next to each other. And I found that by mistake, I typed attention spam. Thank you. I've now sort of fallen in love with this as a sort of shorthand. Because we like to think, don't we, that everything we say or write in our professional and in our personal lives is going to go from our attention inbox into our audience's attention inbox. But because of the limits of our brain, the way that evolution designed it, most of what goes into our brain effectively goes into what I now call attention spam. So your first task, your marketing people, your comms people, also as leaders and presenters, how do you avoid going into attention spam? There's no point thinking about technological benefits and processes and messages if you end up in the purgatory of attention spam. Film reference? Anyone know this film? Did you say they were going to be film questions? Lost in Translation, thank you. Sofia Coppola's 2003 film with Bill Murray and Scarlett Johansson. That's what we have to do as storytellers. That's what you have to do as leaders. We're translators. We need to translate things which can be detailed, specific, and niche into something that human beings can emotionally engage with. I ask lots of clients to send me their challenges, their homework, their questions, and this comes up an awful lot. Hard facts, guys. The opposition, this polarization with emotions. So again, I want to try and suggest to you that storytelling is a great way of trying to make that link. Why? Because stories are all about empathy. I often call stories empathy engines. I don't want to go back to the era of COVID. I know it's quite difficult for us all, but that's what we couldn't do in COVID. We couldn't go to a cinema like the Phoenix Cinema, the oldest continuing running cinema in the UK, and watch a film with 300 people. We couldn't go to see a play. We couldn't go and see a gig. So we couldn't sit in a cinema with 200 people and laugh and cry together at a Richard Curtis rom-com. We couldn't sit and jump at a scary moment and hug our partner. Or we couldn't come out of a Wes Anderson film and go, that was the most Wes Anderson film he's ever made. Empathy. Stories are about empathy. Because we've got to remember, not just in this room, but many of the clients I showed you earlier, tend to fall into the trap of thinking that human beings are the product of physics, maths, and engineering. We're not. We're the products of biology, psychology, and culture. Human beings I like to describe as messy, unpredictable, chaotic, and emotional. Again, if there are any young, very young people in this room, storytelling is still our original social medium. Going back to the campfire. Yes, technology, as Amelia has shown, has changed. It's changing at a revolutionary pace. But we are still naturally born storytellers. And we lose that ability and that trait at our peril. And here's a story I just want to tell you again as a way of just illustrating this. So again, I come from an ad agency background, and I was doing a project for a client, and she said, look, can you come in and help us, because we've got a bit of a cultural issue. The creative people with stubble, beards, and dungarees, they don't really rate the planners. The planners, which is what was my job, they have to understand the brand, the consumer, and give a creative brief to the creatives. And they said, look, they're not really getting on. Could you interview all the creative people and ask them what's the difference between a good planner and a bad planner? And one of the answers stuck with me. And she said, look, I tell you what, a good planner is like a radiator. They radiate light, they radiate heat, they radiate insight. If they come into a room, you sit up, you're waiting to hear what they say. But a bad planner is like a drain. When they come into a room, all of your life force and all of your energy drains away. Quick bit of audience participation, hands up. How many of you know a drain in your life? Yeah, that's about right. The rest of you are just not being honest. And that's my point. Storytelling can transform you. The worst thing you can be, by the way, is a drain who thinks they're a radiator. That's what storytelling is able to do, I believe. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we put ourselves in this position by simply trying to bludgeon our audience, our stakeholders, our C-suite into submission just by the pure proliferation of facts. So I like to say form frames content. Content is what you say about your technology, your service, your product, your leadership. Form is how you say that content. And again, I think it's something we've underestimated. We're so great at creating content. Anyone here called a content manager, by the way? Okay. I just like to tell people who have content in their title, just replace the word content with stuff, because that's all content is. If you call it content, it doesn't make it any better. It's just stuff. It can be good, it can be bad, but it's just stuff. So, let me give you my 3 final tips. Because as I've been saying, facts and information aren't enough. Story can help us, and let's make sure we work with the brain, not against it. So, I talk an awful lot about the golden thread, and it's a classical reference, and if you see my book at the back, it's in gold, and there's a needle and thread on the front. Because whatever you do with your talk, your presentation, your document, how you communicate your service, your technology, you need a thread that holds things together. Because otherwise, it's easy for the brain to literally lose the thread. I've talked a bit about emotions. I want to go back to something called behavioural economics, which I talked about, I think, in one of the previous sessions for Britannic. We need to understand the importance of emotions. And thirdly, one of the key elements of storytelling is the need for conflict. Because if you have conflict, you have a story. Now, I'm going to give you a quote from a famous French philosopher. So again, I asked AI, can you help me? Just do me something French. Well, I mean, there's a sort of baguette spoon thing, there's wine, there's the Eiffel Tower. Surely that's not the right dog. It's got to be a poodle, surely. Although I do like the way it's got its hands, paws coyly, sort of, you know. Brigitte Bardot, Catherine Deneuve. Anyway, so I want to say, any French people and French speakers in the room? Okay. I want to show you a famous quote, and again, Amelia mentioned about less is more. This is a quote from a French philosopher called Blaise Pascal in the 17th century. Right? How true is that? 400 years ago? Nothing has changed. How many of you get emails from your internal team, your HR, legal, or financial, or your clients? By the time you start the email, your children are at primary school. By the time you finish the email, they've left home and they're married. Why do we do this? Use storytelling. Storytelling is a brilliant way of shaping information, as I've said, and keeping it concise and meaningful. It's so important, as I keep saying, to do this to work with the brain. So let me explain the story of the golden thread for those of you who aren't classicists. Theseus and the Minotaur. King Minos of Crete had defeated the Athenians in battle and said, "You will send me 7 young men, 7 young women on a ship. They will be taken to the center of Crete. They will be taken to the center of the labyrinth, a fiendish maze devised by Daedalus, the father of Icarus, who flew too near the sun. And in the center is my son, the Minotaur, and he will tear them limb from limb." And this happened for many years until there arose in Athens a king called Theseus. He said, "I will not tolerate this anymore. I will get on a ship. I will go to Crete. I will speak to King Minos, and I will announce my intention of killing his son, the Minotaur." He arrives in Crete. He goes to see King Minos. He meets King Minos, but he also is introduced to his daughter, Ariadne. And as these things do, Ariadne falls in love with Theseus, and Theseus with Ariadne. And she says to him, "Take this ball of string," often said to be golden, played by my clicker. She says, "Unravel the string all the way from the outside of the labyrinth until you find your way into the center. So once you've got into the center and you've slain the Minotaur, you can trace your way back out again." And I've always loved that story for a number of reasons. As I say, for me, it's about, again, understanding how our brains work. Everything needs a thread that holds things together. Otherwise, the brain can just, as I say, become scattered and lose the point that you are making, whether it's a piece of communication, your leadership, understanding your brand, etc., etc. Now, again, I'm obsessed with language, as you can probably tell. And it's funny how this idea of a thread just permeates our language of storytelling. We talk about spinning a yarn. We talk about fabricating, fabric. But also the most common one, which is like hiding in plain sight. The word text comes from the same etymological root as textile. It's literally something that is woven together, but it's held together tightly. And I often help people doing presentations and presentation skills. That's what you need. You need something that holds things together. Because as I said, otherwise the brain literally loses its thread. I'm a big fan of Philip Pullman. I'm sure some of you hopefully have read his Dark Materials or seen the PBS BBC series. And Philip Pullman has a lovely way of putting it. He says, it's the author's job to guide the reader on a path through the woods. Again, it's a lovely, beautiful metaphor. It's why so many stories, fairy tales, happen in the woods. And again, that's your job. That's the role not just of communications and marketing, but I think of leaders, to find a path through the woods. This comes down to a number of things. Firstly, it understands, again, the role of your brain. Your brain wants things to be coherent. In fact, your brain values coherence more than it does truth. Sorry about that, but it's true. It means it's a process of editing, taking a lot of stuff away and finding your thread. It can be a hypothesis. It could be a point of view. Think how many stories are what-ifs. Again, I'll give you a movie question. Which film? What if you woke up every day and it was the same day? What if you woke up every day and it was the same day? Come on, go with me. Come on. Okay, you get the point. Probably not a true story about Picasso, but it's a good one. Picasso is interviewed in his studio in Paris by a journalist, and she's come to see all the amazing artworks everywhere, all over the walls. But right at the back, there's a sculpture of a lion. And the journalist, she's absolutely blown away. She can't describe how she feels about this sculpture of a lion. So she says, Pablo, because they're on first name terms, Pablo, how do you do that? How do you just carve that lion? Picasso says it's actually really easy. I take a big block of marble and I take away everything that doesn't look like a lion. And that's your job. Your job is to find the lion and take away everything that doesn't look like a lion. And I'll give you one particular tip that I use. It's not actually an acronym, it's an initialism, but anyway. This is what you need to find. Whatever it is you're trying to say, whatever it is you're trying to communicate about your brand, your leadership, whatever it might be, you have to find your thread, find your line, and you'll do that by taking out everything that is true but useless. You know, you're all smart people, you work in tech, you're all running. You're not going to do anything that's not true, but is it relevant? Is it meaningful? And if it isn't, you take it out. Again, it's everything that Pascal said. In other words, you've got to be signal-minded. We often talk about signal and noise, yes? And we know about that. We know that you're constantly trying to raise the signal, and you do that by reducing the noise. I'll give you one example of a client of mine. Came to me and said, look, I'm doing a speech for my sales conference, 200 people, I've got 20 minutes, she said, and I've got 13 things I need to tell them. I said, you can't do that. The answer is not 13, it's what? 3, thank you for listening. So I said, okay, that's what we'll do. We'll do an organogram, we'll get it down to 3. But here's the thing I said to her, and I realized it's a sort of universal principle. In her head, she had 13 examples of signal. But in reality, she had 13 examples of noise. Because if everything is signal, everything is noise. And that's one of the biggest issues that I see with all the clients, not just in tech, because I work with pharmaceutical and retail. It's this obsession with detail and fact. Unless you can get to the signal, unless you can find the story, unless you can find the thread, you risk going into attention span. I've talked a lot about emotions. Again, if you want to ask me later, I'm going to be around most of the day to talk about behavioural economics. If you haven't read Thinking Fast and Slow or Nudge, please do. But here's one of my favourite quotes from an American neuroscientist, annoyingly brilliant and irritatingly handsome, David Eagleman. He says, we don't think the way we think we think. Isn't that lovely? There's not a word in that sentence a 4-year-old wouldn't understand. But his point is clear, which is we like to think we're logical, rational, independent. Most of the time, that's just not true. And again, not just in tech, but all the other sectors I work in often fall into this trap. We have to understand how human beings really make decisions, because the brain is often doing things counter to what we think it's doing or even that we want it to do. As we're in such an august environment, I thought it was appropriate to bring somebody equally august. This is Jonathan Swift. Some of you may have heard of him. He wrote Gulliver's Travels, amongst other things. And he was the most famous satirist of sort of mid-18th century. And I want to give you a quote about how he described human beings, because I like it. It's in Latin, but I'll translate it. He said, human beings can best be described... Oh, we've lost it. I'll just do it impromptu. As capax rationis, capable of rationality, capable of reasoning. And I like that, because I think that's about right, isn't it? We're capable of it. It doesn't necessarily mean that we use it. So again, bear that in mind, whether you're talking to external stakeholders, consumers, whoever. We are capable of rationality. It doesn't necessarily mean we use it. Now, there's a visual gag coming up now, which at the moment doesn't look like it's coming up. Because I was going to say, Jonathan Swift, as I say, just about one of the most famous writers, thinkers, and satirists. I imagine him sitting perhaps in a venue like this or a cafe somewhere in London, thinking how famous he was, how adored he was for selling thousands and thousands of copies of his book. And I reckon he was sitting there with his coffee thinking, I'm going to be the most famous Swift in history. And up till about 10, 15 years ago, he probably was. And can I also say what an honor it was actually going on stage after Taylor Swift? I did clear that, by the way, with her. Just so. Okay, well, I'm going to talk. I've got a lovely picture of Taylor Swift up here as well. I'm going to continue talking. So what does this mean about the brain? Your brain has two processes. And again, I'm hoping this isn't just theoretical, because it's actually practical for how you design your communications, how you create leadership, how you try and achieve some of the things that Amelia's talked about. So we have two systems. System 2, which is your conscious, rational brain, which is hopefully paying attention to me and wondering why the screen is blank. But you've also got System 1, which is your unconscious. And Freud was half right. It's very powerful. He was just wrong about it being filled with sort of dark Greek myths. But the fact is, it's your adaptive unconscious. It's where evolution is doing its best to make sure that you survive and thrive, which is why you often make decisions that are not necessarily in what you think are your best interests. But my point is very simple. A lot of communication, not just in tech, prioritizes System 2, the facts, the rationality, the messages. You've got to do the other thing as well. You've got to get to the unconscious. You've got to prime people's emotions. You've got to create social factors around your tech and your problem. As Kahneman says, System 1 is the secret author of our choices. There we go. That's the picture I thought. So I couldn't get one in blue. So, back to the Phoenix Cinema. Another film reference. So it's important that you engage emotions. Which film's this? You need to get out to the cinema more, people. Inside Out, actually Inside Out too. And again, it's about the power of all the emotions jostling in our unconscious, taking over our actions. Again, it's a really powerful and quite accurate bit of neuroscience. So again, think about what emotions you're trying to involve your audience in. This may seem, again, slightly strange and slightly out there for this audience, but believe me, it will help you get your message across. Golden thread, power of emotions. And now a bit about conflict. Because often clients say to me, oh, we do all this stuff, we do stories. And I'll say, okay, show me. So I'll look on their website, I'll look at their Marcom's material. And invariably I'll say, you know what, those aren't stories, those are case studies. And a case study is, someone came to us, we did this, it was brilliant, huzzah. That's not a story. You need conflict, you need challenge, you need heroes and villains in a story. And I'm just going to give you again one of my favorite quotes. I know I say this a lot, this is one of my favorite quotes. John le Carré, some of you may have heard of him, may have even read his spy novels. And he was asked in an interview, I think by the New York Times, how do you construct a story? What makes a story work? And he gave what I consider to be the single best definition of storytelling that I've ever seen, and it's just about the most simple and concise. He said, the cat sat on the mat is not the beginning of a story, but the cat sat on the dog's mat is. Yeah? Because if I say to you the cat sat on the mat, your brain goes, meh. Do young people still say meh? I don't know. You do? Okay. Because it's nothing new. That's what cats do. They are, notorious mat sitters. But if I say to you the cat sat on the dog's mat, your brain is primed. To use another film reference, there will be blood. And again, that's what stories do. They engage your brain, they involve your brain. And once you've got the brain in a storytelling mode, then you can suddenly fit in your facts, your messages, your information. Without that, as I say, you risk going into attention spam. So I've come to the point, the epilogue of my story. I just wanted to give you 3 examples. Now, I don't want to talk about politics, it's not my role, but I want to talk to you about storytelling. And I do believe this to be true. This was said in the Times recently. I think all politicians, all statesmen, all organizations need a story about themselves. They need to construct something about who they are, where they come from, why they are doing what they are doing. And again, politicians that do that, and we can think about ones that do it well or badly, it just shows the power of a good story. Many of you, I hope, watched this on ITV, beginning, I think, of last year. The Post Office Horizon scandal had been going on for 10, 15 years. It was in Computer World, it was in Private Eye. It hadn't really garnered much attention until it became a drama. Again, heroes, villains, life, death, high stakes. And it was a fantastically successful piece of storytelling. You know, yes, it was about accountancy software, but actually it became a truly human, emotional story, and it reaped the rewards. For my last example, I'm going to, again, trawl the classics. Prometheus was famous for stealing fire from the gods, from Zeus, and giving it to mankind, but then mankind didn't know what to do with fire. Some of you may know about The Sorcerer's Apprentice, originally a story by Goethe, but most of us probably know it as Mickey Mouse in Fantasia. The sorcerer leaves, he leaves his apprentice in charge, he comes up with a spell, and the brooms multiply out of control, and then the sorcerer has to return to repair the damage. And it never ceases to amaze me when I remind myself that Mary Wollstonecraft wrote this when I think she was 18 or 19. What do these stories all have in common? They're timeless stories that talk to us about how it feels when mankind creates something that we can't control. Hopefully relevant for what Amelia was talking about. And let me end with one final anecdote, one final story, one final mantra. This is a man called Abram Games, and I've put his picture up now for several years, and nobody has heard of him. He was a famous artist, art designer, painter, and he worked during the Second World War with Winston Churchill to create some of the famous posters that we now remember from World War II, encouraging people to engage in the war effort. And I went to see an exhibition of his a few years ago at the Imperial War Museum, and I'd never seen this before. He had a motto, he had a mantra. And I just looked at it and I thought, I've never seen a better definition of communication than this. Okay, it's 4 words, not 3. But if you can find a better definition of communication than this, find me, I'll be at the back for the next few hours. If you can find a better one, I'll give you a free book. But I don't have to, because you won't. So, I'll leave you with my final sort of motto and then hand over. Numbers numb us, but stories stir us. After a while, your brain will be simply numbed into submission by numbers and facts and information. It's just how our brains work. But stories stir us. They make us feel something. And we ignore that, as I said, at our peril. So if you like, what I'm talking about is doing a bit less of one thing and a bit more of something else. I'd like us to worry a bit less about constantly having to prove that what we make, what we do, what we produce is so fantastic and wonderful and unique. But do a little bit less of that, but do a lot more of move. They can work together. And again, just thinking about how brains work, that's for me the ideal combination. We are proving, but we are also moving. So I think that's my 30 minutes. As I say, I'll be available at the back, signing books and talking to you and answering any questions. Thank you for your time.